Appreciate being able to talk. I'd like to begin these is to talk a bit about your background. And obviously there is a lot about you on the internet, but just remind me when you started your music education, and was it on the piano?
It was. So I was probably 4 years old when I took to the piano. I started lessons 4.5, 5. We had a piano in the house, and my mother was a singer and teacher, classically trained, and she gave lessons in the house. And so I was exposed to music at a young age and heard her giving lessons in the house. And I was just, from the time I was, I say, 4 years old, I mean, I was just absolutely fascinated by what she was doing with her students, by just listening to the piano, listening to the exercises. And I remember just sort of, I wasn't really supposed to be in the room, but I remember coming in to listen to her lessons and just listen to the piano and listen to the music. And pretty soon, she noticed me just coming to the piano on my own, sitting on the bench. Of course, my feet couldn't touch the pedals at that time. And just sort of trying to figure things out and trying to come up with melodies. And then when they finally heard that I was playing melodies that I'd heard on TV or in concerts that they took me to, they realized it was time to get me lessons. And I begged them for lessons, actually. And I was probably 5 years old at that time.
So your mother was musically inclined. Your father?
No.
No.
He appreciated music, but no, he never studied music.
Where were you raised?
So I was born in Detroit, and I lived there for the first 2.5 years of my life. And then we came to LA after that. And my mom sang in the Roger Wagner chorale. And so I went to, and she also sang in the LA Opera Chorus. And so I went to a lot of those performances when I was very young.
You started music lessons when you were in LA?
Yes.
Was there much social support for you when you were playing the piano? In other words, I've interviewed other people who got kind of socially ostracized because they played music or their interests weren't like other people's interests.
Well, okay, so there was certainly support from my family. And I certainly had plenty of support of people, musician professionals who thought I was talented. But In those early years, was it exactly cool to be a classical musician when I'm talking about the ages of, I don't know, 10 to 15. And no, I mean, I was the only one really pursuing it in my school seriously. And so I think I felt a little bit isolated in that sense. Nobody really understood what I did. I mean, my classmates were impressed with me, but they didn't understand. They didn't get it. They didn't, and most of them were not really educated in classical music, or were given. Many of them weren't even taking piano lessons, and if they were, most of them hated it. So I sort of feel that I was unique in those early years in my environment, as far as students who, as a child, who had parents really seriously interested in classical music.
When you got out of high school, what'd you do?
I was 18. I moved to New York to attend Juilliard.
And you were there for how long?
I was there for 5 years. I studied both at Juilliard and Columbia. I had two main teachers at Juilliard who had a major impact on my education and influence on my artistry. That was Herbert Stesson and Jerry Lowenthal. And then in the summers, I studied with different teachers at music festivals.
Was there somebody between the time that you started piano lessons and the time you got out of Juilliard who you think really pushed your buttons in a good way?
I feel very fortunate to have been able to have met my very first teacher and worked with her for about a decade. Her name is Sarah Chang. She lives in Los Angeles, and she was an ideal teacher for me from the age of 5 to 15, because she exposed me to so much repertoire. And she was a very versatile musician herself. She was not just a pianist, she was a bassoonist. And she knew the opera repertoire well. She knew the symphonic and chamber. So she really exposed me to a lot, took me to a lot of concerts, and she was just the right kind of teacher for me, and was extremely generous. And she always went out of her way to introduce me to as many important pianists coming through town in LA as she could. And then I worked with Daniel Pollack, who is a concert pianist and professor of piano at USC. Worked with him through my high school years, and he made a big impact, had a big impact on my playing and my development, on my, really, mostly I'd say on my technical development. And he was a student of Rosina Levine, and had really gave me a strong foundation in my technique, so that by the time I entered Juilliard, I could play anything. And then both of those teachers, Herbert Stesson and Jerome Lowenthal, and I would say particularly Jerome Lowenthal, because I worked with him longer. He was an active performer. Herbert Stesson was not a performer. So Lowenthal was, he knew the career, he knew the players in the industry. And so he could serve in a way more as a mentor to me than Herbert Stesson, who was a wonderful piano teacher, but a little disconnected from the profession. But in my case, I never really worked with one teacher of one school. They came from different schools. And I think that actually, at the end of the day, was a good thing for me. I have a very big repertoire, and I feel that I'm not a product of just one style of piano playing and comfortable in one kind of repertoire. I mean, I worked with people from the Russian school. I worked with people from sort of the Austro-Germanic school. I worked with people from the French school. Jerome Lowenthal himself, I mean, his teachers were William Capel, Alfred Cortot, Rubinstein. So I really feel very fortunate to have been exposed to such a breadth of different schools of playing.
I was looking yesterday at an article published by Classic FM about the heights of composers,
Hmm.
and like Beethoven was 5'4", and Grieg was 5'1". Rachmaninoff was 6'6". How tall are you?
6'4".
Of course, one of the advantages, I assume, is it really makes the keyboard not seem so long to you as it might to others.
Well, I'm not sure the long legs are an advantage. Well, the legs are only a problem if they don't fit underneath the keyboard. You have to find a way to adjust your bench, and so it all works. But no, I mean as long as their feet reach the pedals, that's all that counts.
This past week you played Liszt. You had that all memorized.
Of course.
How long does it take you to memorize a piece?
It's hard to say because that's a piece that I learned many years ago, and I don't remember. New pieces, it seems that they take me, pieces that I say new pieces that I learn now at this stage in my life seemingly take longer to memorize than the pieces I learned as a teenager. And I guess it's like language, kids, the younger you are, your brain's like a sponge. You learn languages easier. It takes me longer to memorize. Very happy I learned so much music when I was young, because especially most of the standard concerto rep, because what I found is the music I learned then really sticks. It sticks and stays in my mind as an adult. And there are certain pieces, it's just like, I might not have even played them for 2 or 3 years, but if I learned them between the ages of 10 and 18, they're still in my head. I don't need time to rememorize them, reconstruct my interpretation, but not to memorize them.
Yeah, I was going to ask that if you had a concert next week, would you have to get the music out and practice before you got into rehearsals for something that, is the standard repertoire?
Well, it depends. I have a number of times stepped in for concerts at the last minute of pieces I haven't played for a while, and I've accepted those offers, those engagements, because even though I hadn't played the piece in a while, I knew that the pieces were solidly memorized in my fingers. I think I always feel better going on stage without the score. I feel freer. I feel I can just listen better. I can pay more attention to my sound than if I have the score. The score can be a distraction. But of course, if the music is not solidly memorized and your anxiety about it not being memorized runs the risk of impeding your ability to play freely and play your best, then I always use the score. I really don't personally, I don't have a problem with any pianist who uses a score. I think at the end of the day, I care how it sounds. And just personally speaking, I think I play better when I don't have a score.
When you are playing, is there anything going through your head?
Like what I had for lunch or what I'm going to have for dinner.
Or
No, of course, there's a lot going through my head, but ideally, what's going through my head is being in the moment and enjoying the experience. Those are the best performances when you're in the moment. You're not thinking about what's coming up, or you're not thinking about what you just did. You're literally living inside the music and enjoying being inside the music. Those are the best performances, but not all performances are that way. Sometimes you are really thinking about what's coming up. For example, per our conversation about memory, if the piece is not solidly memorized, you may have a roadmap in your mind thinking, okay, I need to remember that when we get to the recap in a sonata or in this concerto, it modulates to A major and not E major. And sometimes you need to with a piece that's just really not really in your blood yet. You need to, becomes a part of the performance. And sometimes, you know, there's other things that you have to consider, just the needs of the conductor. The conductor says, please look at me here, or please watch me, or listen to this instrument in the orchestra. And you need to sometimes just remind yourself to do that. And that may or may not take you outside of the music just for a second. But the pieces that I've done many, many times that are in my blood, I don't think, and I also find that the best collaborations, you hardly have to even look at the conductor, because you just feel the music.
I looked over your schedule that you
Mhm.
have published on your website, and you've played with Viome, who you played with in Atlanta this past weekend, several times.
Right.
So you must have a certain comfort level with him as a conductor.
Oh, of course. And we also, we rehearsed the list a lot before we got to Atlanta. And actually, I had done it with him a long time ago. So no, the more you can rehearse with the conductor, the better, in advance of the rehearsals with the orchestra, so that you're really on the same page with the tempi, with everything. And usually that's not what happens. You just you arrive and you have 1 hour before. And sometimes magic happens that way. Sometimes the lack of rehearsal really creates this energy and spontaneity, which can be really good. But generally, in a piece that's not always the most straightforward, where there's tremendous traditions and lots of tempo changes, I think it's really good to rehearse a lot with the conductor.
But have you been with conductors and orchestras where it's been kind of not good?
Oh, of course, of course. Now, but those are two different questions, orchestras and conductors. And obviously, the better the orchestra is, the better I play, and the easier it is for me to do my job. Orchestras know how to phrase, and they don't rely on the beat or the instruction of the conductor in every way. They just feel where the music is going, and they just sort of do it on their own, and they really listen to what you're doing, and that makes your job so much easier. And a good orchestra is steady. That makes it so much easier to play a concerto in a difficult passage. If an orchestra is not steady, it adds a whole new, if the orchestra slows down, if it rushes, if it's not together with itself, that adds a whole challenge to you, to your technique, because you have to find a way to be together. And at the end of the day, it's a collaborative process. And so I always try to make the best of whatever situation I'm in. We have no choice. We have to make the best, because we want the music to sound as good as possible. That's what our job is. But sometimes with lesser orchestras, you have to make more compromises, and that can be disappointing. They can't handle certain tempi. They may want to, but they just can't. Whether the tempi are fast, whether they're slow. Maybe a wind player has certain needs of the breath. So obviously, the better the orchestra it is, the more enjoyable it is. And then with the conductor, you know, what is very interesting is an excellent conductor can make a rather average orchestra sound good. Just like an excellent piano technician can make a rather average piano sound good. I used to think so much of it was the piano or the pianist, but you know, I really think that I'm amazed by some of the technicians I worked with who are just magicians. Give them a few hours on a piano that you think is just unplayable, and they work wonders. And so I think, to answer your question, of course, I've had experiences with conductors and orchestras less than ideal, but I'm one of these people that says, I'm going to make the best of it, and I'm going to, and if it requires making some compromises in those situations. I do it because at the end of the day, if you don't, you may be right, they may be wrong, but then you're all wrong if you're not on the same page.
I noticed also you've played a lot in Southeast Asia, or
In Asia, I
yeah,
went to Southeast Asia. Yeah,
and
I've played in a lot mostly in Japan, some in South Korea, Hong Kong, and Vietnam as well, in Macau.
when you play there, I assume most of the communication is in English.
Oh, yes. I mean, at least in a rehearsal with orchestra, I've never worked with a conductor who does not speak English anywhere, actually. Oh, that's not true. Actually, I've worked with, it wasn't in Asia, it was in Eastern Europe. I worked with a conductor who didn't speak English, so we spoke German. But in Asia, every conductor has spoken English, and it maybe speaks to the orchestra in the language of whatever country we're in, but with me, always in English in front of the orchestra.
Do you have any views on why it is classical music seems to be thriving in some of the countries you mentioned, say, as opposed to the US? I don't want to overdraw that too
Right.
far because I'm not sure it's on its dying legs here in the US. But anyway, do you have a sense of that?
One reason is it's a very obvious one, if you know this, but that I think the statistics are now in China, it's like 1 in 2 students take piano lessons. 1 in 2 kids take piano lessons or violin. So it's education. And it's been this way for a while. And I'll tell you, playing in Asia is it's a wonderful place to work for so many different reasons. But I don't want to lump Asia into one category because each country is so unbelievably different. I mean, I've worked more in Japan than anywhere else. Japan is a wonderful place to work because, first of all, the tours are so well organized. The pianos are all exceptional, and they're almost all excellent Hamburg Steinways. The piano technicians are excellent. The concert halls are excellent, and the audiences are excellent. And not only are they knowledgeable audiences, they're quiet audiences, and they're audiences that buy lots of CDs. So it's sort of the ideal place to perform. And again, that's because of education. There are certain TV shows in Japan that deal with stories of classical pianists and anime shows that deal with the music industry. So this has really become a part of the Japanese culture. Classical music is not just like a fringe thing. And as I say, in China, it's exploding. I mean, so many students play piano. And there's a why is there such a value? I think that part of it is there's a belief that this is good. Studying music is good for the development of the brain. The government has also been on board with this value and supported the arts as needed. So
I'm wondering also, one of the difficulties in the US is the growing diversity, that as our country becomes more diverse, classical music isn't necessarily part of the cultures that are coming into this culture. And that some of the Asian cultures don't have quite that issue. Or am I totally wrong?
I've never thought about that. But then by that observation, then the arts should be equally thriving in places like Scandinavia. that are less diverse, more
Right.
homogenous culture, which are, though, all of those countries are becoming more and more diverse every year. I don't know. I really, I know that at least in public schools, when my parents were growing up in Detroit, they had incredible music education and strong, many high schools had decent orchestras, and that's sort of a bygone era.
Mhm.
But I never considered diversity as a factor in this, but it could be. I don't know. I haven't given it enough thought.
One of the things that I've noticed about U.S. symphony orchestras that actually they can be quite diverse within sort of a limited kind of diversity. A lot of women in U.S. orchestras that sometimes you don't see in Europe, for example. Certainly a lot of Asian players. You see that a little bit in Europe, but not nearly as much as here. So we do have a kind of diversity that's very good, it seems to
Mm.
me. And in some ways, we're different than Europe in that regard.
At the end of the day, I think it just comes down to, again, education and what you're exposed to, whether it's by your family or by the school. And these, in countries where music education is valued, there's, I think, a larger attendance of audience members at classical music concerts, larger, more subscribers, more listeners, and consumers of recordings. And but the what's really, we're living in a very exciting time, because we've all been forced to sort of reevaluate our approach to selling classical music and generating audiences and sustainable audiences. And in the last 10 years, I'm just amazed at the amount of innovation I've seen in our industry. People are really trying all kinds of things to spur interest in what we do. And sometimes these techniques work and other times they don't, but people are trying. They're really, and I'm amazed, on social media, I'm looking at my colleagues and what they're doing, and I'm like, there's some people who are just, I'm really impressed with them, because they're really doing things that I think, and they're speaking about music and doing projects that I think are really hopeful for our future. And because there was a time 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I just felt it was a bit stagnant. We were just sort of using the same formulas again and again and again. And now, obviously, our industry has become much more visual. And that is a good thing, in the sense that whatever it takes to get people in the concert hall or interested, I think is in general good. Of course, the only risk of this is that we start to train our audiences to listen with their eyes instead of their ears. And I do feel that that's happening a little bit now, because, again, it's not just the music industry, it's our whole culture, which is just so visual. And the internet and social media has made us so visual. But classical music is not, I mean, in the concert hall, and is not about the way it looks. It's about the way it sounds. And I think we have to be a little careful about that too, that we really, because, I mean, it's clear if you go on YouTube, most of the time the videos that have the biggest number of hits are also visually stimulating.
Right.
And I think that's great, as long as the quality is there in the music.
Well, to some degree, it's the same thing. I think in cinema, Martin Scorsese said that he believes that most of the superhero movies that we see today, which are very visual, aren't really cinema. They're like
Mm-hmm.
video games. They're not good
Right.
storytelling.
Right.
And I guess because we have easy access to all kinds of visual stimulation, it's difficult for people to go into the traditional concert hall because really it isn't
Yeah,
very visually stimulating. But then, what do they say? Music is a way that we fill time. Visual art is the way we fill space, and they're different
no,
function.
absolutely. But you know, if we can combine the two, I think that can be really powerful. And I think I've done concerts that have, whether it's been through lights or through projections or whatever, I mean, have done some really artful things that are really that work in congruence with the music. And I think that even, you know, the fact that musicians care a little more about what they wear on stage, I think that's a good thing. Again, if the number one value is the music making itself, and that's not just a mask to compensate for something that's lacking. You know, for a while, I mean, there was just this, we were in this sort of stagnant situation where all classical music would walk on stage wearing a tuxedo with a bow tie. The orchestra would be dressed the same way, and the same and the shell and the concert backdrop would always look the same way. And I think that that's can get boring for audiences, and we need to shake things up. People are now looking to perform in very unusual venues all over, particularly in the US. I mean, I find that people are getting very creative and about where they perform and trying to draw new audiences, and whether it's in the crypt of a church or if it's out on a floating dock. I mean, we've seen all kinds of things like this recently, and I think it's wonderful. House concerts are more popular than ever.
You mean like going to a residence and playing?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually why I'm in Dallas now, because I'm giving a recital this week. I was auctioned off for a charity here to give a private recital, and it's a wonderful charity. And I actually enjoy these concerts. It's a very different kind of experience. It's an intimate experience. Acoustically, it's a whole new experience. And of course, let's not forget that this is how much of the music we play of the 19th century was meant to be heard. Chamber music in homes.
Maybe Scriabin, he was right because you know he had these grand plans to have music and light combined, and maybe he was onto something very early on, even though he seems like such an eccentric.
Yeah, but then with him, there was also the element of that he really saw certain colors with certain tonalities, and that was very important to him. I'm not sure he was thinking, I don't know how much he was thinking about the needs of the audience or how much that would resonate with them, but for him, he felt that, and he had that ability. I think that we're doing all kinds of things now. They're doing a lot of these, you know, movies with the orchestra live, and I think that's wonderful too. I think that I enjoy going to those. Actually, I've gone to a number of them at Hollywood Bowl because a friend of mine, David Newman, film composer, has conducted a number of these concerts, and it's exciting to see the film with live music. It does make a difference. It makes it a new kind of experience. It makes the film come alive and seem that it's not just caught, it's not just in the can, so to speak, and just, you know, non-living. It makes it sort of feel alive. And of course, they amp up the sound in those concerts, and so it's a little, you're more aware of the score. As to whether or not these kinds of concerts are bringing in new audience to the concert hall, I've been told not so much.
Right.
But if they make money for the orchestras, terrific.
Right.
Finding a creative way to make a few extra bucks for the orchestra is just, it's so important. It's vital.
Absolutely.
And this is it's not a sellout kind of thing. It's a very viable and very noble endeavor in a way, because it's really about highlighting the importance of the score in a film which is often so overlooked.
It's interesting, though, because they're very expensive for tickets, because you're paying not only for the orchestra, but you're paying licensing fees and those kind of things,
Right.
with regard to the symphony. So it gets really expensive for a family to
Right.
attend. That's one of the perceptions of classical music, that it's very expensive. That people have to pay a lot, but in general, it's a lot less expensive than going to a football game.
Absolutely. You know, people are kind of, there's a lot of misconceptions about our industry, and that is one of them. And there's all kinds of things people do for entertainment that are far more expensive than attending a concert. And if you really look at the prices, you know, they vary wildly from one event to the next, or just within, you know, for the seating within one event. I mean, could be low as $10 to up to, you know, $50. Of course, if you're talking about the Metropolitan Opera and the Paris Opera, there ain't a cheap seat in the house.
That's right. Unless you get somebody out on the street selling them.
So, but you know, in Paris, where I also live, you know, what's one thing I've discovered this year that's quite wonderful is, like, there's so many little theaters in each arrondissement that I went to see a play recently that cost, like, literally the ticket was like €10. And I just thought, oh my God, and it was a wonderful play in a very small theater. And I thought, going to the cinema is far more expensive than this. It could be like double the price. So, no, I think that that people think that our events are expensive because of often where they're located, or how people dress, or who they associate going to attend them. But in reality, they're far more affordable than you think.
I've kept you long enough. Anything you want to add?
This has been very enjoyable. I didn't even need to get in my car and go anywhere.
Yeah. Well, hey, it was great talking with you.
You too, William.
And good meeting you also.
Absolutely, likewise. And I look forward to seeing you next time.